Hi, Josh.
Right. Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm fine. How you doing?
Good. I should say for our podcast listeners, I'm Robert Wright, and you are Joshua Hammer, International Man of Mystery.
Yes.
And
Says so
you
on my
know,
business card. Yeah.
what's that?
It says so on my business card.
Yeah. Well, I would recommend that in your case. Josh, you have many laurels to your credit. You've written 3 books. You've been Mideast correspondent for Newsweek. You covered Africa for Newsweek. Now you're in this kind of freelance, globetrotting, foreign correspondent mode, writing for various periodicals. But you know, when I tell people about you, those are not the things I mention. When I want to get people's attention about you, I point to what I consider your most distinctive accomplishment. And do you know, can you guess what that is?
Well, I'm guessing this must have some. You must be reaching back to my embarrassing undergraduate years. I hope you're not.
No, I'm not. Josh, I would never do that to you.
Yeah, Bob, please. Okay.
Because I think we have a. I think when it comes to college, we have a very stable, mutually assured destruction deterrence situation.
I was going to say the same thing. Perhaps you're talking about my kidnappings, double kidnappings. I don't know.
You're getting there. I say to people, you know, journalism is a dangerous business. It could happen that you'd be covering Iraq, say, and get abducted by extremists, or you might even be in Gaza and get abducted. But there's only one person I know who has been abducted in both Iraq and Gaza, and that's Josh Hammer. And I guess so the first question has got to be, what is it about you and abduction, Josh?
What is it about me and an abduction? I guess I just have a habit of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, Bob. It's sort of what I've made a name for doing. And yeah, I guess I do have that distinction. I don't think there's anybody else. Perhaps some can claim 2 abductions, but I think the geographic split is sort of a
it's the diversity, yes. It's the scope. It's the scope that impresses me.
I have not yet been taken by Hezbollah, however. So, you know, or the Taliban. So I'm working on it.
The trifecta awaits you.
Okay.
But meanwhile, let me just actually we'll get to those. I want to ask you about both of those down the road because we're going to be talking about both Iraq and Israel. But let's get right into your recent travels. You've been to Afghanistan most recently to do a couple of pieces.
Yeah, I was in Afghanistan for about 2.5 weeks. I did well. The main reason for my going was to get embedded. I've really never spent any time in Afghanistan. It was sort of a blank, with the exception of a bizarre 3 days with the Taliban at the tail end of the 2001 war. But I had never even been to Kabul or been with the U.S. troops. So I sort of to round out my global war on terror education, I got myself embedded in a very nasty part of the country, in a very remote fire base near the Pakistani border, which turned out actually to be a lot more intense and dangerous than I expected it was going to be. And but you know, a very interesting place, a very good story, I think. And on the going in and coming out, I did something for the New York Times on Kabul. So
well, yeah, you did like a travel piece about Kabul, right?
It was actually their idea. The travel editor heard I just happened to stop in his office when I was in New York last, mentioned that I had this Afghanistan trip in the works, and he said, "Well, I understand they've opened a 5-star Serena hotel in Kabul. What's this all about? Maybe we should do a story on tourism in Kabul." So I agreed to look into it when I was there, and it is a bit of a stretch, Bob, but I think I managed to. Make
I've got to say I was puzzled when I heard you were doing a travel piece because maybe I just hang out with an unusually risk-averse crowd, but I don't know anyone who is planning to go to Afghanistan for the holidays.
The Serena Hotel was definitely empty, yes. I was embraced by sort of like a long-lost brother by the guy at the reception desk, and I just scanned the lobby and did not see a lot of people in that place, so... but it is beautiful. It's got Aga Khan poured about $50 million into the place, took over an abandoned, basically mortared hotel in the center of town, and has turned it into a place as beautiful as any 5-star in Europe or the United States. It's a true anomaly.
And this.
Yeah.
The city itself, you described as being pretty safe, right? In contrast to some other parts of Afghanistan.
I did not feel threatened. Now, granted, I had no, just kidding, not 6 bodyguards. I did have a discreet. I was told that when I went wandering through the bazaars or out on the mountains overlooking the city, I should bring a security guy with me, and I did. But he was discreet. He wasn't waving a weapon around. I'm not even sure he had a weapon. He was just a local Pashtun who knew the score and was vigilant. But I never felt the least bit threatened. I in fact felt welcomed by people. And it's a rather strange situation. As I point out in the story, you have constant security alerts. You have people sort of living behind bomb blast walls, much as you have in Iraq. I mean, the landscape is not quite the same, but people live. There is that sense of high security and sense of that anything could happen at any time, and yet at the same time, there's kind of a relaxed feeling about the city. It's really a dramatic difference from Baghdad. I mean, well, Baghdad is just beyond the pale, but even a couple of years ago, when the insurgency was just heating up in Baghdad, 2004, it was a much tenser place than Kabul is today.
And do they like Americans in Kabul?
I never got any sense of hostility from anyone. I wandered into the thick of the old bazaar by the river, which is just this kind of a place where one can easily be, whisked off the street and kidnapped, as I know something about, and vanish, for months on end. But it never happened to me. And I met a lot of Americans who were actually and Europeans who were working in the city doing rehabilitation. They may have one bodyguard discreetly working alongside them, but they're out and about. I mean, they go shopping, they wander through the city. It's really, I don't want to say it's a safe place, because tomorrow we could be reading there was a suicide bomb and, taking out a NATO convoy, but, it's definitely not Kandahar. I mean, the southeast of Afghanistan is where the real problems are, where the worst problems are. Kabul is really kind of, has a sense of being fairly well protected.
So then this fire base you were at, that was in the southeast?
Actually not. What's happening is...
my geography is so bad that you're telling me it's along the Pakistani border.
Well, I would qualify that. I'd say that basically once you get out to the Pakistani border, you're in trouble, no matter where you go, north, east, whatever. North Afghanistan, South Afghanistan. You've got the regular infiltrations of the of Taliban foreign fighters. Nobody quite knows. I believe the description is anti-coalition forces or something like that, which kind of applies to a whole compendium of people. Taliban.
So it's not
others.
So it's not all that unified in opposition. Taliban is a misleading term in a way.
Well, you have, for instance, in this part of the country that I was in. Believe me, I'm not an Afghanistan expert. I got steeped in the politics and the situation there, based on a very intense couple of weeks. My understanding is in this particular region where we were, which was a province called Kunar Province, near Jalalabad, if that means anything to you, sort of east and north from Kabul, that this area, the people in this valley pledged allegiance for still unexplained reasons to a warlord named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who you may
that name goes all the way back to the Soviet days.
Yeah, exactly. He was a big mujahid during the Soviet days who was responsible for causing a lot of chaos and death and misery in Kabul and much of the country. And then he allied himself with the Taliban after the U.S. A lot of the warlords sort of played ball with Karzai and the U.S. military. Hekmatyar chose the Taliban path, and I'm not even sure where he is at the moment. He might be in Pakistan, but a lot of his fighters are now, I gather, allied with the Taliban and basically carrying out these hit-and-run attacks against Afghan National Army troops and Americans and NATO coalition forces whenever they got the chance. So this particular valley I was in, which was called the Korangal Valley, a very remote, very cut-off, isolated place, very hard to get into. very hard to get out of. This place was really sort of hardcore Taliban country, and it was kind of a laboratory. It was really very recently moved into by American forces in early 2006. Well, for the last 4 years, there has been a very light presence of American troops. They've had Marines, Navy SEALs going in, comp squads, doing covert ops, whatever. It wasn't until earlier this year that 2 battalions, Marines and U.S. Army, went in and began to try to clear out the Taliban and then occupy the area, create a permanent presence in this valley, and attempt to win the quote-unquote hearts and minds of the people there. So
had this been Taliban country pretty much forever? In other words, we never uprooted the Taliban there, or is this an area that has been repossessed by the Taliban?
My sense is that this is an example of a part of the country that, because we don't have very many forces in Afghanistan. The total coalition forces amount to about 40,000 troops, I believe. It's a big country. It's bigger than Iraq. I mean, we're spread very thin there, and this was kind of one very remote part of the country that we just never bothered with. And as a result, the Taliban retreated in there after 2001. I don't get the sense that they ever really left. I get the sense from talking to the U.S. intelligence guys and the company commander that there was always a force of 500 to 1,000 fighters in there. I mean, when I say fighters, these might have been people who, are farmers by day and Taliban at night, or Taliban by day and farmers at night, whatever. There has always been an anti-Western, pro-Al-Qaeda, pro-Taliban group in there. I mean, one officer I talked to insisted that Korengal was one of the valleys, if not the valley, where Osama and company plotted the 9/11 terror attacks. Now, I have not verified that. It wouldn't surprise me. It's a very, as I said, an isolated place that before there was a real push into it by the U.S. troops would have been an ideal sanctuary for him. And I'm sure that these areas where where Osama is now, across the border presumably, are not much different from the terrain that I was in during the course of that week.
So if these fighters are like farmers by day, does that mean that we face the same dicey situation we faced in Iraq, which is that it's not that easy to fight these guys without risking the kind of collateral damage that can increase sympathy for their cause? Or is the fighting more out in the open than that?
That's a good question. I'm actually writing. I'm just at the point in my piece. You've anticipated this perfectly, Bob, because this is what I'm trying to explain in the story. The soldiers you're out there, they're using a lot of heavy weaponry. It's, I have never been exposed to so much mortar fire in the course of 4 or 5 days. But what they're basically firing at are these sort of blank walls of forest across the valley, pretty much uninhabited, except for these mortar teams and snipers, Taliban mortar teams and snipers who sort of use these ridges, which look down upon this American fire base, to attack American positions. So they argue that they can fire off their mortars and not really hurt anybody, that they've already given orders to the villagers to stay out of those mountain areas because they will run the risk of being attacked. They say that they're very careful not to fire into villages, even when it is clear that they're taking fire from villages. They insist that they're not shooting back. So, in a way, it's interesting because a lot of them have been in Iraq. A lot of these guys have been in Iraq in places like Ramadi and Baquba and all the nasty parts of Anbar province where the insurgency is just raging out of control. And you kind of get the sense that they've come away a little bit chastened, at least some of the more sophisticated ones, and that at least this operation in Afghanistan may offer an attempt to learn from the mistakes that were made in Iraq and be a little more careful. I'll give you another example. One of the things I noticed a couple of years ago when the insurgency was just beginning in Iraq, I was out with some U.S. troops in Fallujah in late 2003, and went out with them and kind of witnessed, rather to my horror, this nighttime raid on several houses where these troops were kicking in doors, really all the stuff we've read about, when we read about losing the hearts and minds of the people, was all playing out in front of me in November 2003. They were, basically abusing civilians, treating these women and kids pretty roughly, kicking and hurting the men around at gunpoint, disparaging them, referring to them as Hajis, a sort of disparaging term for all Iraqis, and just basically displaying a kind of contempt that I think ultimately, helped to accelerate this insurgency. So, you see...
And they did all that knowing that you were watching, that a journalist was watching.
Absolutely, absolutely. It was sort of second nature to them. It was kind of horrifying. And one thing I hear is that these troops, when they go into these villages, they actually, the American forces, although it's clear that there's a lot of, there are arms caches and Taliban or opposition, insurgents working out of these villages, the Americans will not go into these villages themselves. What they do is they establish positions outside of the village, overwatch they call it, and then they send in, for better or worse, the Afghan National Army to do the door kicking, on the assumption and the belief that the Afghan army will be somehow more sensitive to that, and that the Afghans themselves will be more receptive to a local force going in and breaking their doors down and herding villagers into the street, whatever. I don't know how effectively this is playing out, whether this is making a difference, but it does show that there's a level of consciousness about the mistakes made in Iraq and an attempt to correct them. Now, the question, of course, is, are these Afghan National Army soldiers any more disciplined or sensitive than their American counterparts? And based on what I saw during the few days I was with the troops, I would say not necessarily. I mean, these guys tend to use a lot of firepower. I've heard stories of guys. One interesting tale of, I was up at a forward sniper position way up in the mountains above the fire base. It was 4 American snipers and 3 Afghans living side by side. The sort of the front, really the forward operating post. When the Taliban attacked, these guys were the first to know. And the Americans were telling me that basically when any human being walked along this far ridge line, the Afghans would open fire. The Americans were trying desperately to tell them, no, you don't open fire on any human being you see. You have to ascertain who they are. The Afghan position was, all Taliban. The Americans would say, no, this is a woman. The response would be, Taliban wife, Taliban wife. So it was this sort of culture clash that was being worked on. And, I saw myself that these guys are trigger happy. At one point we were fired on from the hills above the base, and the Afghans just unloaded. They're very well, unlike their Iraqi counterparts, they're very well armed. And they just responded to a little bit of provocation by firing off probably 20 mortar rounds, machine gun fire, opening up with everything they had almost indiscriminately. And I was told that this was pretty typical.
So, on balance, how do you feel in terms of your optimism and or pessimism level? I mean, it seems like just over kind of the last 6 months, at least it's gotten to the American kind of popular media that Afghanistan may be in serious trouble. What's your sense?
Well, my sense is that we're nowhere near a mass insurgency chaos that we have in Iraq. But on the other hand, I haven't been. I mean, first of all, the area that I was in was very sparsely populated. Yes, it was under. This U.S. base was under constant attack every day. It was hit by mortars and machine gun fire. But because the villages are small, the terrain is vast, you don't have this kind of feeling of, you don't have the urban warfare, the urban chaos that you have in all over Iraq, and that's a fundamental difference, I think. Now, the South I did not get to on this trip, so Kandahar, I mean, certain areas of the country, from what I understand, are really out of control, or out of coalition control, firmly in the hands of the Taliban. So my answer is it doesn't appear to be going well. There are probably some areas of the country that are peaceful. You can probably say the same. I mean, you can say the same thing about Iraq. I mean, tourists go out to western Iraq, to Mazar-i-Sharif, to Herat, to Bamiyan. That whole part of the country is relatively safe. So, but there are, and Kabul, as I said, appears to be fairly secure. Unlike, now that's a critical difference. I mean, in Iraq, you also have a capital that's just the sort of, seventh circle of hell, whereas Kabul, which is, symbolic of the whole, destruction and chaos engulfing the country. In Afghanistan, you have a capital city that is in relatively good shape. So that's a fundamental difference.
Yeah, in your travel piece, you quoted somebody, I guess like a tour guide, saying about Afghanistan, it's always been easy to conquer and hard to control. And it's funny because shortly after 9/11, when I was teaching at Penn, I went to a seminar, and there was a speaker who knew a lot about Afghanistan's history. And what he said, we were anticipating the Afghanistan war at that point. And what he said was, good luck keeping that place together, because historically the most anyone has ever been able to accomplish is the loosest form of centralized control, if that. And
right.
And so I remember after the Afghanistan war thinking, just because I had heard that, we better have a serious plan for keeping this place together if that's what we want to do. And of course Rumsfeld didn't really go that route. I mean, he opted for what I would call a fairly minimal force. Now it's under NATO control, not American control, but people still say there's not enough boots on the ground. I mean, is your sense that a breakup of Afghanistan it could be in the works in the long run?
I don't know about a breakup. If you're talking about a breakup as a kind of ethnic divisions along the lines of what people are talking about in Iraq, but I mean, essentially you've got from what I understand. Again, I don't want to present myself as an expert, because I'm sure there are journalists who may be watching this, and other Afghan experts who know a hell of a lot more about the situation than I do. But it does seem like there already is a kind of fragmentation, that Karzai's control doesn't really extend that far outside of Kabul, and that basically it is a sort of warlord-based country. It's running on warlords. Karzai has established a certain amount of relationships with these guys. There's a bit of NATO support there that has prevented the country from just spiraling into chaos. Although this whole eastern area, especially with Pakistan as a sanctuary, is going to be a problem for a long time. Interestingly, I talked to Rory Stewart. I quote him in the story also. He's an interesting guy who you may be aware of, who wrote a book called The Places in Between, and another book called The Prince of the Marshes. He's a British diplomat, former soldier who served in Iraq and now runs a foundation in Afghanistan, speaks Dari, knows the culture really well, has spent a lot of time out in the middle of the backwoods, like where I was. And he says that basically the Americans are kidding themselves if they think that they're going to succeed in a hearts and minds campaign with the people that they are working with, for instance, in a place like the Korangal. That, yes, these Afghans will take their reconstruction projects, they'll take their bridges, they'll take their roads, but fundamentally they're always going to be allied against the outsider. That the Americans are outsiders, they're non-Muslims, they're modernists, they are just a sort of continuation of the British-Soviet invader model that these guys are just predisposed to fight against, and so they will always choose the Taliban, local fighters who speak their language, over these outside forces. Now the Americans are trying to lay the groundwork for the eventual Afghanization of this valley and the rest of the country. That they say that they're simply acting as the next step before this is turned over. But Stewart just but Stewart
that has kind of eerie.
That
word has kind of eerie historical echoes. I mean, the word that comes to mind is Vietnamization. Remember when that was the plan?
Iraq is Irakification, whatever. I mean, there's no telling that this Afghan fighting force is, going to be successful. Although, again, the U.S. soldiers I've talked to insist that they're well equipped. They've got a lot of weapons. They've got good morale, unlike their Iraqi counterparts. Little problem with the discipline. but they claim that they're ahead of the Iraqis in that regard.
Yeah. Now, one scenario you hear is that if the Taliban takes over all or most of Afghanistan, it could have dire effects in Pakistan in terms of kind of fueling the fundamentalists there. Now, you're going to Pakistan soon?
Yeah, next month I'll be in Pakistan for a couple of weeks.
Have you been there before?
Many times. Yeah.
And what's your take on
2000.
Pakistan in terms of its level of stability and its vulnerability to the kind of destabilization these people are thinking about?
Well, that's one of the questions I'm looking into. I just think that there seems to be a delicate balance right now. I mean, I think you have basically an army that really it seems to me, doesn't really want to confront the Islamicists in the tribal areas, either because of pro-Islamic sentiment within the army and the ISI, or because they've gone in there a few times and been bloodied, So I think Musharraf has to, there's always been talk of this double game that Musharraf is playing, where trying to placate the Americans and make it seem as if he is being tough on terror and on the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda elements, and that's why you see these occasional bombings of madrasas and dramatic attacks in those areas, followed by a rollback. This treaty that was signed last year between Musharraf and tribal elders, in which he agreed to withdraw all military forces from this particular tribal area. It's a very unclear. It's a balancing act that he's trying to pull off, and it doesn't seem to me like Pakistan's about to blow up anytime soon. But as you say, the Taliban conquest of Afghanistan, which I also think is unlikely, could fuel all this. But I just think for quite a long period, you're going to have this sort of constant level of instability and this insurgency flaring up along the border, and the U.S. trying to win the hearts and minds fairly unsuccessfully, and taking casualties, although certainly not on the kind of intense basis that we're taking in Iraq. But on the other hand, there are 1/10 or 1/8 as many U.S. troops in Afghanistan as there are in Iraq, and on a percentage basis, I think the casualty rate is pretty high. The company of soldiers I was with in Korengal Valley, 130 guys roughly, and over the course of the last 5 months, they've had 9 guys killed in action and something like 25 wounded. So that's probably a rotation here. So we're talking maybe a total of 250, 300 guys rotating in and out. But still, 35 casualties out of 300 guys is a pretty high rate. I think that compares maybe even unfavorably to similar companies in war zone in insurgent areas of Iraq.
Well, do you agree with everybody who says we need more boots on the ground, or is there any other sense in which you think our approach right now is deeply misguided?
More boots on the ground, it just sort of depends on who you talk to. The Americans would say we do need more boots on the ground. Somebody like Roy Stewart, who I, to a certain extent, trust. He's a very culturally sensitive guy who really knows Afghan culture, as you can tell from his book. Will say it's just going to compound the problem, that the cultural dissonance, the cultural clash, is the native hostility from the population is already so great that just throwing in more American forces is going to, sorry, I'm waving at my son who is just back from school, but I'm on the air, so.
Well, if he wants to join you, I'm sure he has his kinds of insights.
He can say hello. There he is.
Hi.
Hi, how you doing there?
This is Max.
How old are you? How old is he, Josh?
He's 5.5.
5.5. And he's going to school in South Africa? Is that where you are?
Yeah, he's going to school at the American International School of Cape Town, but he's in his last week. Summer break is coming, and we're moving to Berlin, Germany. So he's about to go to school at the John F. Kennedy School in Berlin, bilingual English-German education.
Wow.
So
he's going to be cosmopolitan.
He is a cosmopolitan guy.
A member of the global elite.
The global bilingual
Well,
novel?
tell him that. Thank him for his appearance on Blogging Heads, and tell him the check is in the mail. Okay.
Check is in the mail, kid. Go off, and I'll see you in a little while. Anyway, where were we? You can go in the pool in a little while. Bob, pardon me for this momentary break in the action. Matt,
They love this, Josh. The viewers love this stuff. Don't worry. Drag it out if you can.
My son is insisting that he goes into our swimming pool, which we'll only be able to enjoy for another week before we head for the Arctic winter in Germany. So, but let's keep talking. Where were we on all this?
Well, I think we'd kind of wrapped up. You had talked about the basic kind of razor's edge question of whether more troops are just making things worse, or that's what we need. And you mentioned this guy Rory Stewart, who
I would
is on the
recommend
former
his
side of
book.
the question.
He's not paying me to do a plug, but I did read his book of The Places in Between, which is apparently, I think it actually spent some time on the New York Times bestseller list, and it's a solitary journey he took on foot from Herat to Kabul right after the war, where he just went into the most remote corners of the country, places that no Westerner, or few Westerners had ever penetrated, and gave you a sense of the insularity and of the majority of the population, and how.
Okay.
Yeah. So. Anyway.
Well, we will encourage readers to read it, even though we have not yet signed up for that Amazon program where we get a piece of the action. We'll still link to it. That's just the kind of people we are, Josh. Now, quickly on Iraq, where you also were. When were you in Iraq? A couple of years ago?
I've been there. My last trip was for Newsweek in May 2006, this year.
So fairly recently, and
fairly recently.
I guess today the Baker report is coming out, and I gather it's going to make the following clear-cut declaration. We should kind of get out of there slowly, more or less, but leave a few people there, so far as I can tell.
Right.
What is your sense of things in Iraq, or about the case for withdrawal, or anything? I mean, you must have been you must have a totally different perspective from somebody like me who's never been there.
My feeling about Iraq is that it's just been and I've been watching this whole thing from the very beginning, and saw the rise of Muqtada al-Sadr, was there at the beginning of the insurgency, and was almost killed by the insurgents in Fallujah, as you know.
You mean when you were abducted?
When I was abducted in May.
Hey, you want to just pause here and focus on that? I gather that the Gaza abduction did not especially scare you. They never drew their guns or anything, and you had a sense that ultimately these people wanted to release you. What was the Iraqi abduction like? Who were these people?
Local Iraqi insurgents, fortunately, because this was at a time when, as you may remember, in the aftermath of the just about the time of the first American invasion in April 2004, after the Blackwater guys were killed and strung up on the bridge. This was a period where Al-Qaeda was, and al-Zarqawi, who I believe was in the city at the time I was being held, was gaining a foothold. And in fact, within a couple of months, they would dominate Fallujah. So there were really two groups operating in the city at the time. The people that happened to abduct us were local Iraqi guys, just young, everybody from adolescents to 30, 40-year-old men who had just gathered into this rudimentary insurgency to fight the Americans. And they were less inclined to kill a Westerner just for the sake of being a Westerner than the Al-Qaeda guys, some of whom I had heard were sort of hanging out in the next house. So it was very touchy. The whole time we were in this position, we were being told, this has to be kept discreet. If the bad guys or the more extreme guys find you, you may not get out alive. So, although these guys themselves were divided among themselves about whether or not to kill us, they suspected at that time that we were. This was a time, a week after the U.S. withdrawal, a week after this very bloody incursion by the Marines, where they just blew up a lot of houses and killed a lot of civilians. And there was just a tremendous amount of anger on the streets, and we just walked in like idiots, believing that we had somebody with us who knew what he was doing, and were captured and taken and accused of being spies, and it was very touch and go for a while. But we were fortunate enough to be in the hands of local Iraqis and who were under some kind of influence by the most powerful imam in the town, who was able to secure our release eventually.
So did they take you at gunpoint?
They did take us at gunpoint. Yeah.
So were you scared to death?
Scared as hell. There were about four or five moments along the line where I was where I thought it was about 50-50 that the moment had come.
And what are the psychological effects of that? Did you have a religious conversion or anything, or think about your parents?
I go into these horrible situations, and I somehow I must be internalizing it, and at some point I'll turn into a serial murderer. But the photographer I was with was really shook up afterwards, and spent about 2 weeks, essentially secreted inside his hotel room and didn't come out. I mean, he was psychologically devastated. I mean, I internalized it. It's not something I really like to talk about too much. It's one of the few pure moments of my life that makes me uncomfortable, except for some adolescent mistakes, which I won't go into. But this and undergraduate periods. But this was
I remember those. We don't need to talk about those.
But this was an excruciating 9 hours. I wrote a long piece about it for Men's Journal, and I happened to pick it up the other day, just leafing through it after being away from it for 2 years, and it was painful to read because.
Okay, we'll link to that if it's online. So anyway, but as for Iraq, you're no more optimistic than the next person based on what.
I'm not. I think we're damned if we do and damned if we don't. I think it's in a way it kind of reminds me. There's a kind of dynamic in place here that reminds me to a certain extent of Lebanon's civil war, or at a lower level, the Palestinian Intifada that I witnessed from 2000 to 2003, where the killing begets killing. You have an effectively ineffective Iraqi army. You have a U.S. military that is really just spread too thin to make much of a difference. Can't protect the people. You have these two. You certainly have a civil war. I mean, the numbers are far bigger, as far as I can tell, than anything that happened. Even some of the worst days in Lebanon. I mean, the numbers we're talking about. And I just think you've got this, revenge and retaliation mentality going on now, as you did Israel and Palestine. Again, but that was on a much lower level. That is so vicious and so out of control that it really, I don't see any way out of it for a while. I think this whole thing has to just play itself out, until I think the question is going to be I really think the solution to this, sadly, is going to be exhaustion. Because you have had this steady, incremental thing, going on and on, despite the presence of U.S. forces, despite the supposed training. I mean, I remember when David Petraeus, General Petraeus came in, I believe, early 2003 or early 2004. He was going to train these troops. He's a can-do guy, a very impressive guy. He was going to take control.
He was on the cover of Newsweek, and it said, "Can this man save Iraq?"
I spent some time with him. I mean, this was an optimistic period. I want to know what happened. I think somebody should go back, get Petraeus on your show, and find out what happened. He was, he was telling this is going to be a tough job. I spent a couple of days with him flying around Mosul, inspecting the army, hearing numbers about how we've already trained several battalions. Things are moving along. Now we're almost 3 years later. And I just want to know what on earth has happened during those 3 years. Petraeus left, obviously, sometime after that. But it's like this 3-year period, where zero has changed. In fact, it seems like it's sliding backwards. It's a bizarre a mystery to me how we could have botched this so badly and have an Iraqi army that is completely incapable of protecting the people in that country. Now, obviously, the sectarian violence has played a great deal has contributed to this, because, in this kind of horrible ethnic, atmosphere filled with ethnic hatred, soldiers just take their own sides. And that's I think, the fundamental problem or one of the fundamental
Yeah.
problems in Iraq. So I don't see any way out of this. Withdrawing troops, putting more troops in, accelerating the training, making Maliki, giving a series of deadlines or incentives. I just think that this spiraling downward is so out of control now that it will probably go on for months, years, before the two sides are just exhausted. I mean, I hope this is not the case, but I just have seen this sort of steady slide over the last 3 years with no successes, really no successes.
Yeah, it's like if we couldn't figure out how to solve the problem the way it was three years ago, what are the chances that we're going to come up with a miracle solution now? Well, moving on to another bright spot in the world, the Israel-Palestine situation. You spent a lot of time there. I don't know how recently you've been there,
A year
but
ago.
that's another place where I find it hard to be real optimistic at the moment. Partly, I guess, because I think the people in charge of policy are not as enlightened as they might be, but also because, the dynamics are just not all that hopeful. What do you think?
No, I don't see any changes there in the near future. I mean, there have been sort of blips along the road. I mean, I thought that after the death of Arafat, the withdrawal from unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, I was perhaps naively thinking that the roadmap could be the infamous roadmap could be reimplemented or something along those lines. But it just seems like neither. No, there's a sort of stagnation dynamic in effect here. Yes, I guess we have another ceasefire. I don't know, but I can't tell you how many of those ceasefires I lived through during the Intifada that lasted for a few weeks, and then the whole killing dynamic returned. I mean, the difference, of course, now between now and when I was there is that it's a pretty localized conflict. The West Bank has been effectively sealed off. You're not getting suicide attacks in Israel very much. You're getting these occasional rocket attacks on Sderot and areas around Gaza. So it's
this is just because of the wall. This is just because of the security wall.
Absolutely, because of the combination of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the sort of relentless attacks against Palestinian militants that went on 2003, 2004 under Sharon, simultaneous with the construction of the wall. Basically, they've created in the West Bank a situation similar to what you've got in Gaza, which is essentially an imprisoned population, for the sake of Israeli security. So, basically, we're talking about some rocket attacks against Israelis living near Gaza, and incursions by the U.S. military, by the Israeli military into the Gaza Strip. 15 Palestinians killed here, another 10. That sort of very sad, unending dynamic that, as far as Israel is concerned, it's far worse for the Palestinians than it is for the Israelis. But of course, the Israelis are a little not too happy about having to deal with these rocket attacks periodically against their population. But so it's much more low level than it was, I think, at the height, 2002, 2003. But it certainly doesn't show any signs of going anywhere. I mean, the Palestinian government is stalemated. It's Olmert is weak and doesn't seem to have any ability to, doesn't seem to have any desire or ability to push through any sort of political initiative. So where's the momentum? There is none.
Yeah, and on the ceasefire, I gather, as is commonly the problem, Islamic Jihad has not signed on, I think, right? I mean, if there even is still a ceasefire, I've lost track, but...
Well, the ceasefire, I'm talking about the most recent ceasefire. But Islamic Jihad, you can sort of trace this whole thing. When I was in Israel last, I guess it was in April 2006 or May 2006, Hamas was still abiding by this hudna with Israel, whereas Islamic Jihad basically had said, screw you. And they were carrying out, periodic suicide bombings whenever they could, which wasn't often, but occasionally, as well as they were the ones running the rocket attacks out of Gaza. So they've sort of never stopped, and Hamas kind of has had to play catch up after in the last few months. So the recalcitrance of Islamic Jihad, even after the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, was sort of an indication of where things were going and just the great difficulty of getting anywhere in this conflict. You still have a very defiant, militant wing of Palestinian society that basically couldn't give a hoot about for whom the Gaza withdrawal was simply another opportunity. It doesn't really get us anywhere.
If Hamas were part of the government, or if it just were the government, I mean, in other words, if either the results of the election had been kind of allowed to proceed to the point of an actual government, or if this recent initiative of some kind of unity government between, I guess, Fatah and Hamas had gone forward. I mean, if Hamas was governing in a more meaningful way, would they have the capacity to clamp down on Islamic Jihad, or do you think that's just always going to be a loose cannon?
Well, I don't know. Look at the first few months of after the Gaza withdrawal, because I think Hamas was at the height of its influence at that time. It had just won big in the Palestinian territories, and as I remember, Hamas was basically applauding Islamic Jihad. Islamic Jihad was essentially functioning as a Hamas proxy at the time. There were a couple of suicide attacks. They actually, I went back at that time up to Jenin or Tulkarm and interviewed the family of one of the bombers who successfully gotten through. And as I remember, Hamas applauded this attack. Here was a government of the Palestinian territories essentially applauding the actions of a radical group that had just carried out a suicide attack. So it sort of, indicates that a fully empowered Hamas government might not be any more disposed to cracking down on Islamic Jihad than a chaotic, weak Hamas government with no real power.
Well, would it have the power to if it wanted to? I mean, in other words, if it were part of the government, and a precondition for its, if this condition were somehow imposed from the outside or were just a reality, it felt that a precondition for its continuing to be recognized as a government were to actually control the border, the violence within its borders, which, of course, is what governments in modern states are supposed to do. It's part of the definition of a government. Would Hamas even have the power to do it if it had the will?
Well, this was always this tortuous question that we were going around and around with during when Fatah controlled.
Right. Did Arafat have the capacity? Right.
Arafat, was it a question of not having the capacity or not having the will? And even Fatah would never really articulate which was the truth there. I mean, they said yeah, we have the capacity, but we cannot carry it out because it's against the will of the people, and we have to abide by the will of the people. And also that if they attempted to do so, they risked a popular uprising as well. So I don't necessarily know that Hamas is any more powerful, has more control over the security apparatus than Fatah does.
And what is the ultimate source of Islamic Jihad support? I mean, they must have some degree of grassroots popular support. If it would be so hard for even Hamas to clamp down on them, what is the source of that?
You mean why is it popular, or who is
why is Islamic Jihad popular? Why does it have some intrinsic strength?
I'm not sure it's all that popular. I mean, there's certain refugee camps on the West Bank. It's like Palestinian resistance in general remains fairly popular because Palestinians are not happy. And it's kind of just almost a historical accident and other factors involved about which group people throw their weight behind. In Tulkarm, for instance, Tulkarm was always an Islamic jihadist center of allegiance, as was Jenin. The Jenin refugee camp was a real Islamic jihad hotbed. And I guess certain corners of Gaza probably have Islamic jihad allegiance too. But they have now sort of stamped themselves as the real rejectionists, proudly stamp themselves as the rejectionists. You know, they shun a role in government. They shun any kind of dialogue. They shun any idea of a ceasefire. From the beginning, they've refused to do so. And if you'll pardon me for a brief moment with my son.
No problem.
Yes, you can. Okay.
All right, that sounded like a happy boy.
So Islamic Jihad is, you know, I guess attracts the allegiance of the most rejectionist wing of Palestinian society that just doesn't see any hope in dialogue or, you know, a Palestinian state, and thinks the only solution is to keep firing, you know, keep attacking in whatever way they can.
Is it your sense that suppose magically you could convince Palestinians that a Palestinian state, let's say in the extreme case going all the way up to the 1967 borders, okay, a Palestinian state with true sovereignty was within their reach, and you could really, you just laid it out on the table. Is your sense that at that point there would be enough support for that scenario so that you could have coherent government within Palestine that would control the violence?
But that's a really hypothetical question, and you have to get into, you know, that's the problem with this whole situation. Is that 1960, you look at the Barak and the Camp David, 2000 agreement offered a Palestinian state, but you know there was still, even though it looked to a certain extent looked good on paper, there was still a raging debate within Palestinian society about whether or not it was good enough, and there remains a debate today. 6 years later, in spite of all of the violence and death. And the fact that the Palestinians are farther away than they ever were, there are still many, if not most Palestinians, who'd say we were right not to accept that. So what do you mean by a Palestinian state? You mean like all the settlements withdrawn, control of the Jordan River, sovereignty over East Jerusalem? I mean, maybe if you could just make out a deal, offer them a deal like the Saudis proposed in 2002. Remember that ill-fated Saudi plan, which was pretty much along those lines? All that the Arab states would confer recognition on Israel if Israel withdrew all of its settlements, retreated to the 67 borders, turned over, as we said, all the sovereignty of East Jerusalem and control the Jordan River and air and water rights to the Palestinians. That's the kind of deal that I think the Palestinians would need before.
But that scenario where Israel truly withdraws back to the internationally recognized 1967 borders is just not realistic in terms of Israeli politics, right?
No, right. It's not going to happen. And that's, and Hamas, it's not even clear if Hamas is going to be satisfied with that, although Sheikh Yassin, before he was blown to pieces in 2004, did say that he would, and told me and told others that if Israel did withdraw, then there would be a long period of peace, a long hudna, that he wouldn't call off the struggle, that the goal of eradicating the Jewish entity from the Middle East was still fundamentally a part of the Hamas charter, but that they could live with it for a while. So maybe the best we could hope for. That's why I think peace is a very elusive proposition there for a long time.
Okay. And by the way, how's your brother? The one you wrote a book about.
My younger brother.
Speaking of Israel, is it you wrote what's this book called? Chosen by God?
Chosen by God, yeah. A brother's
and it was in Israel that it's about your, I gather, more or less fundamentalist brother.
Yes.
And he had his conversion in Israel, right? Or
He did, but he left Israel after about 6 months. But it all went down in the yeshiva in Jerusalem, and now he lives in upstate New York and has been living there for going on like 25 years now. Hard for me to believe, and is still, he's got 9 kids. He's every bit as devout as he was in 1981, and, it's his life. It's his life.
Yeah. I have a fairly fundamentalist Christian sister. Maybe they should get together and talk. I don't know.
Yeah,
what's that?
They might have some things in common as far as Judea and Samaria, as long as your Christian sister doesn't lead it to the next level and talk about what happens when Jesus returns, right? Because I think that's when it all reverts.
No, I think at that point they'd have to part ways. They could talk about the end times in a kind of vague way.
Yeah, that's true. Well, you know, there's been common ground there, as we know.
Yeah. I don't know. Well, quickly. Well, we've consumed a lot of time, but you've had a couple of other stops on your mystery tour. I just want to touch on. One is you went to Kenya and wrote this piece for for who? For Outside Magazine.
Outside, yeah.
Yeah. It was a piece about a white rancher who's accused of murdering a couple of black poachers. I'm just wondering. In general, you've actually spent a lot of time in Africa over the years, and you're there now.
You know, I lived in Nairobi for 4 years in the early '90s, so sort of my backyard in a way. Pretty familiar.
The American view of Africa, I think these days is kind of dim. There's not a sense that a lot of good. It's not like there's a crisis everywhere, but it's also that you don't hear a lot of good news about, say, the sudden emergence of stable democratic governance or anything. I mean, are there positive signs you'd point to that aren't getting pointed to anywhere, or is this going to be another part of the world where we wind up being depressed?
Well, look, I live in South Africa, and I think South Africa has been generally a positive story here. You know, it's 12 years after apartheid. I'm sitting here in Cape Town, and periodic visits to Johannesburg, travel around the country. You know, the place works. The place works. As far as beyond South Africa, I'm thinking. You know, the problem with Africa, I think, is that, you know, we tend to focus on these, like, horrific meltdowns in places like Darfur and in Somalia and the Congo, and, you know, I can name a half dozen other places. But, you know, while ignoring the sort of steady, basic stability that does exist at a very poor level. Granted, I mean, you know, we're talking marginal stability and marginal, you know, quality of life, but in places like Ghana, places like a lot of West Africa, a lot of East Africa, Uganda, Tanzania, Mozambique, places work, places get along. I would say, look, I was in Africa in the early from 1992 to 1996, where I witnessed the Rwandan genocide, the Somalia meltdown, the Liberia and Sierra Leone were completely at the mercy of arm-chopping rebels, Charles Taylor and Foday Sankoh and company. Zaire was under Mobutu. You know, it was just one horrible story after another. Even down here, things were pretty violent in '93, you know, before the election. But I'd have to say that compared to that period, yeah, there are some problems, but things are better. Things are better, you know. So, but again, Africa may be one of those places where, you know, there are always going to be parts of this country, of this continent, that are in turmoil because of the just tremendous poverty and instability and poverty is really fundamentally what it comes down to. And so, you know, you may have some periods along the way that are a little better than others, like right now.
Are some of the countries you point to as being relatively stable, growing in prosperity at all?
You know, it's funny. Like I compare the map of 1993 to the map of now. Liberia was in the middle of the Civil War. Now it's got a female president, Ellen Sirleaf. Things are peaceful. I mean, that's a marked improvement. It's got a potential. Ditto with Sierra Leone. That place was in absolute agony until 2001. Now it appears to be unbelievably, you know, growing and getting some stability. I mean, that was Dante's Inferno. Zimbabwe. Now, Zimbabwe, 1993 seemed like to a superficial observer a place that was humming along. You know, beautiful cities. As I wrote in the New Yorker piece, my visits there, I was always amazed by how much better it was there than Kenya. You know, now you go to Zimbabwe and it's a basket case. It's this constant ebb and flow in Africa. You know, that can be maddening. And
final stop is this piece in Smithsonian. Now, is that already out, or
You mean
You went to Brazil.
I'm writing for them every month these days. I've been quite. They've been keeping me very busy. The Brazil piece that I just did.
Yeah, where it's basically a story of indigenous peoples against rapacious capitalists who, in particular, have a penchant for logging and mining, and so are chewing up large amounts of Amazon forest.
Yes,
And I guess
that's coming out in February.
Okay. So that is yet to come. So maybe we shouldn't spoil the punchline, but I mean, it sounds. What I was amazed to read was that I think you said that in the last 2 years, 9 tribal chiefs have been murdered, and the basic idea is that ultimately this is the rapacious capitalists knocking off these tribal chiefs, right? I mean, that's the suspicion.
Strange. Sadly, in Brazil, I think that's in the Amazon, especially that kind of thing is the norm. I've been periodically venturing up to that corner of the world over the last 10 years. It's 3 times. It's always been. You always hear about tribal chiefs being gunned down. I mean, Chico Mendes, he wasn't a tribal chief, but he was, their interests coincided. I mean, it's like the constant tale, the constant conflict up there between the big landowner loggers and the people who are trying to keep the Amazon in a fairly pristine state. The former seem to be winning, and the latter are losing. So, but if you're looking for a good ongoing conflict, the Brazilian Amazon is the place to go.
Well, okay. I mean, I guess the good news is it sounds like the indigenous peoples have figured out a kind of smart strategy, which actually involves you in a certain sense, which is to say that, they're, first of all, they're doing this whole map about, where their cultural milestone, their key cultural touchstones are.
It's an interesting concept that was actually originated, I believe, with one of the Indian groups, and then was like embraced by this organization called the Amazon Conservation Team, based in Virginia, and they provided a lot of funding. I think they got USAID money and some other Annenberg Foundation money. The concept behind it is that you get these Indian tribes together, and you create these cultural, historical nature maps. Very sophisticated maps that take quite many months to do and digitalize, and get the whole tribe involved, get them to just bring them in touch with their environment, and in the process somehow politicize them and make them aware of the value, economic and otherwise, of preserving the rainforest. So it's been going on now for 3 years, and it sounds like one of these lofty-minded do-gooder concepts that, who knows, may actually have some benefit. It's certainly, the telling thing about it is that it's gotten these loggers and miners ticked off enough to start killing some of the people behind it. So
this strategy has done that.
Yeah, well, but it's more than that. The case I'm writing about, I don't want to give too much away, but the case I'm writing about is this particular Indian chief made his fellow tribal chiefs agree to barricade the roads of the reserve and keep out all logging in return for Amazon Conservation Team coming in and doing this map and creating jobs and training them and undertaking this project. So it was sort of he got everyone else on board, he politicized them, tying it to this map, and therefore got the vested interest in the country and in the area angry enough to want to kill him. So what looks like a sort of a simple cultural, innocuous project actually has a certain political dynamite to it.
Yeah, and I mean, apparently they have the wisdom to point out the implications of destroying the forest for, global warming and so on, and it seems like to the extent that they alert Westerners to this, some real political leverage might be exerted on their behalf, and in a way, your Smithsonian piece will be part of that, and in that sense, I guess you are the opposite of a capitalist tool.
Well, I'm certainly not getting paid like a capitalist tool should be. So,
Yeah, no, you're an indigenous people's tool. and that does not pay as well. No, I'm sorry to inform you of that. Oh, well, listen, Josh, this has been great, and.